Abdu'l-Baha's journeys constitute a unique event in the history of humankind. Never before and at no time since has such a personage of such spiritual stature himself carried the pure beams of the revelation from the east to the west. Over the course of his travels between 1911 to 1913, the Master touched many hearts and transformed many lives. These stories offer a brief sampling of his legacy. After leaving the Holy Land in 1911 and passing through Egypt en route to Europe, Abdu'l-Baha boarded a ship bound for Marseille, France, and made his way north to Thonon-les-Bains. Here he took up residence at the Grand Hotel du Parc, in this thermal spa on the shores of Lac Léman. Laura Barney had not seen him for several years, since their table talks in Acre, which had led to the famous compilation Some Answered Questions. Since then, she had married the Frenchman Hippolyte Dreyfus, and one beautiful sunny day in August, soon after his arrival, the Dreyfus-Barney couple met Abdu'l-Baha in Thonon. Meanwhile, another believer, the artist Juliette Thompson, had been waiting in London for permission to join the Master too. She also travelled to Thonon. Now once again in the presence of her heart's king and her soul's beloved, she felt her own insignificance keenly and found herself abashed before him. "Are you happy, Juliette?" he asked one day, noting her discomfiture. "Are you happy to be here? How many years since you were in Acre?" "A lifetime," she responded, and covered her face with her hands before His Majesty. At Hotel du Parc, Abdu'l-Baha also encountered one of his compatriots, the Persian prince Masoud Mirza Zellus Sultan, the eldest son of Nasr-ed-Din Shah. As the governor of several provinces in Iran, he had persecuted the Baha'is zealously, and was responsible for the execution of the innocent king of martyrs and the beloved of martyrs in 1879, as well as at least 100 other Baha'is. Having encountered Hippolyte Dreyfus in Persia some years earlier, Zellus Sultan met him again and begged to be allowed into the presence of the Master. He was pacing the terrace of the hotel when they found him, and at the sight of him, Zellus Sultan began to murmur miserable excuses for the atrocities he had committed. But as they approached, the Master turned to greet the prince with open arms. To Hippolyte's astonishment, he embraced him, saying, "All those things are in the past. Never think of them again." What a lesson in forgiveness, Dreyfus thought. A few days later, Juliette was full of excitement. "We did the most amazing thing," she cried. "The Master, Laura, Hippolyte and I went for an automobile ride." "Did you ever think, Juliette," said the Master, laughing as we got into the car with him, "that you and Laura would be riding in an automobile with me in Europe?" The countryside around the thermal baths of Thonon-les-Bains was very picturesque. Hippolyte had told him of the Devil's Bridge far down in the forest, a place celebrated for its beauty, and the Master wanted to see it. In the Middle Ages, villagers who tried to cross the precarious path slipped and fell and were said to have been seized by the devil. The Master was so impressed with the freshness of the grass and fields and the lushness of the hills that he wrote to Munira Khanum, "From the day I left Iran until now, I had not seen such a place." On their return, they came upon a spectacular waterfall. To their terror and wonderment, the Master was so excited and moved by the sight of it that he walked to the very edge of the precipice. Laura and Juliette watched their lord with tears of wonder and awe.
Abdu'l-Baha was recognised as a celebrity from the moment of his arrival at Victoria Station in London, which he had travelled to by ferry from France. His stay in this famous capital of the West caused much excitement, and many independent photographers jostled about trying to take pictures of him whenever he was in public view. Lady Blomfield, in whose home in this high-class neighbourhood Abdu'l-Baha was a guest during his stay, finally approached one of these image hunters. "Do you think this is courteous to be continuously hounding a respectable personage?" she asked, with some hauteur. "No, madam," was the reply, "but if others succeed and I fail, my chief will think me a fool." When Abdu'l-Baha heard of this exchange, he laughed heartily. "If the photographs must be taken, it would be better to have good ones," he said, and then consented for a formal sitting at a photographer's. Many wished to visit the master at 97 Cadogan Gardens. Amongst them were ambassadors, maharajas, politicians, theosophists and religious leaders. His day began in the early hours, and he breakfasted around 6:30, having already seen many visitors by then. Given the high demand to see him, appointments had to be made ahead of time. One day, a woman rang the doorbell to see the master without a prior appointment and was denied a meeting. As she left, the master heard of it and asked Lady Blomfield to rush outside to bring her back, as a heart has been broken. In weeks that followed, the master delivered public talks to several congregations and met a wide variety of audiences. The Lord Mayor of London welcomed him to the Mansion House, where discussion focused on the social conditions of great cities. The master even found time to visit a seriously ill writer at an East End hospital, as described by Lady Blomfield in her book, The Chosen Highway.
Many sought for an audience with the master in Paris too. A materialist philosopher and celebrity in his own right, Henri Bergson, came one day together with a group of his pupils to meet the master in this charming residence in Paris, furnished by Monsieur et Madame Dreyfus-Barney. He wanted to question the master about the existence of a creator. The master spoke of the differences of opinion between those who believe that nature governs the universe and those who believe in God. Bergson asked whether Abdu'l-Baha thought the 2 points of view could be reconciled. Since he was known to be partial to metaphors, the master provided him with one. "Suppose," he said, "you take a handful of salt and throw it in a sweet water lake. Can you say the water has no salt in it, even though it does not taste salty?" After some reflection, Bergson admitted that the presence of salt could not be denied. Abdu'l-Baha then compared salt in the water to intelligent design. Bergson was so impressed by the master's analogy that he thumped the table with his hand and left the meeting.
After disembarking from the ocean liner Cedric on the 11th of April 1912, the master was driven to the Hotel Ansonia on the corner of Broadway and 73rd Street in New York. It was one of the most modern hotels of its day, famed for the luxury of air conditioning. That same afternoon, he attended a gathering of all his devoted followers at the Kinney home. The house was thronged with visitors. There were so many that they could hardly avoid treading on each other's toes. Everyone who was able to come was there, nudging elbows and jostling each other aside to catch a view of the master. Certain friends of the Baha'is had also come, and one was the Unitarian minister Howard Colby Ives, who had been invited by Mountford Mills. He had agreed to attend the gathering with some reluctance at first, but now, after a mere glimpse of the master, he longed to see him alone and without interpreters. So the next morning, driven by this irrational hope, he returned to the Ansonia. Crowds had already begun gathering there to see the master, and Ives had made no appointment. But to his immense surprise, when the master appeared among them, he found himself motioned to follow him. They walked single file into a room, and once there, without any interpreters, and with his heart's longings mysteriously fulfilled, Howard was moved to tears. He was so overwhelmed by the master's presence that he left the hotel still weeping. His life was never quite the same again, as he wrote in his book, Portals to Freedom. It was a longing of Abdu'l-Baha to visit the poor and homeless in New York, and so it was arranged for him to visit the Bowery. A journalist and illustrator by the pen name of Kate Carew accompanied the master on this visit. She had come to interview Abdu'l-Baha at the Ansonia Hotel and was surprised that a prisoner and spiritual leader would stay in such an opulent place. "Does the attention paid in this country to material things sadden you?" she asked. "Does it argue to you a lack of progress?" The master responded, "Your material civilization is very wonderful. If only you will allow divine idealism to keep pace with it, there is great hope for general progress." Kate Carew had many more questions to ask, but the master was keen to go to the Bowery. "I love them," he explained simply, regarding the poor he was going to meet. And once the interview was at an end, he took Kate by the hand and proceeded with her to the shelter. "I consider you my relatives, my companions," he told the people there, "and I am your comrade. You must be thankful to God that you are poor, for His Holiness Jesus Christ has said, 'Blessed are the poor.' He never said, 'Blessed are the rich.' Jesus himself was poor." He also told the homeless tramps how Baha'u'llah lived among the poor for 2 years, how he ate with them, slept with them, and felt it an honor to be one of them. Abdu'l-Baha's message went far beyond words. He had asked 2 of the Baha'is to take $200 of his own funds and exchange it for small coins. When he finished speaking, he took his place by the door with the 2 believers beside him, holding their bags of cash. As he shook the hands of approximately 500 impoverished souls that evening, he slipped 1 or 2 quarters into each of their palms, just enough for a night's lodging. Kate Carew was profoundly impressed. Her brief interview produced the lead article on the front page of the New York Tribune. "That demonstration of Abdu'l-Baha's creed," she wrote, "did more to convince me of the absolute sincerity of the man than anything else that had happened. It was done so gracefully, without any fuss or fume. And as I went out into the starlit night, I murmured the phrase of an Oriental admirer who had described him as the breeze of God."
An incident that exemplified Abdu'l-Baha's commitment to racial equality happened while in Washington, D.C. He had been invited by Ali Quli Khan, the chargé d'affaires of the Persian legation, to attend a luncheon in his honor. Alexander Graham Bell, the inventor of the telephone, and Admiral Peary, fresh from his conquest of the North Pole, were among the dignitaries invited to the reception. Among the Baha'is were the artist Juliet Thompson and Louis Gregory, who'd been invited at the last minute on the personal request of Abdu'l-Baha. When the luncheon was announced and Abdu'l-Baha was leading the invited guests to the dining room to be seated, the master suddenly noticed that Mr. Gregory was not there. "Bring Mr. Gregory," he said, and while awaiting his arrival, he rearranged the place settings so that Louis Gregory had the seat of honor at his right. When Louis Gregory joined them, Abdu'l-Baha announced how pleased he was to have Mr. Gregory there, and in the most natural way, he proceeded to give a talk on the oneness of mankind. Abdu'l-Baha's visit to Chicago included a gathering in Lincoln Park, where he accepted to have several photographs taken of himself with groups of children and youth. Decades later, in 1987, on the 75th anniversary of his visit there, a few of those same children had something to say about it.
And I was so greatly impressed every time I would see him. He'd pace back and forth on the stage, and he's just, you see such power latent within that person. There was a famous American artist who became Baha'i, Mrs. Juliet Thompson. She said just to look into those eyes was enough for her. And as he stood back and forth on the stage, you can just see and realize the strength and power that is within that body.
When he entered, it was a very impressive sight. As small as I was, I could see the radiance or the dignity of this man who was to make such an impression on all our lives. As he sat down, of course, I was impressed too by the fact that he was using a chair that was very similar to the chairs that kings are coronated in. And so the whole picture of Abdu'l-Baha sitting there in all his splendor was imprinted on my mind. He called each of the younger children up first and placed them on his lap. He kissed some of them on the forehead. He patted some on the head. I was patted, if I remember, as he put his arms around me. And I had a feeling that I would prefer to be on the floor, that I wanted to get off his knee. But everybody asks, what did he say to you? Well, he did talk to each one of the children. He asked their names and whispered something to them. Of course, if you see any of the pictures of me, I looked like I was very unhappy. So I kind of think that he said, please be happy.
I think I had the pleasure of sitting on his lap, as they tell me, because I was only just over a year old. So the recollection of his face and feature is not too good. But I think that I had received some of the spirit that he always gave forth. And for that, I feel very gracious. And I don't think that is something that I would treasure forever.
Abdu'l-Baha sat down, and the rest of us were in the room, of course, but we didn't sit at the table at that time. However, he seemed to devote much of his attention after he had shaken hands with the friends to the children. And children are impressed if adults give them the love, and Abdu'l-Baha sure could do it. And I just stood there and gazed at him. I don't remember too much about it, but Mother always tells me. She said that he asked me what I would like, because there was a big dish or a bowl of fruit. And I always liked bananas, so he gave me one, and I treasured that very much. That's a blessing that I hope I will be worthy of as time goes on.
My mother wrote to Abdu'l-Baha asking him if he would please name me. And my mother belonged to the women's club in the town we lived in. And she got no answer from Abdu'l-Baha. And these women got up in arms saying, when you going to name that baby? And my mother said, when the name comes from Haifa, I'll name him. So they said, no, we'll name him. This happened to be the town of Clyde. We'll name him Clyde. So I had the name of Clyde for quite some time until the letter came from Abdu'l-Baha, the tablet, I should say, and he said, name thy baby Joseph.
The fact of my mother's healing, for over a year, she had a tumor of the breast, and they didn't know in those days whether it was cancerous or not, or anything much about it. But it was a serious condition. When she was in Abdu'l-Baha, when she walked into the room, the light was so bright that she was practically dazed. She couldn't, she described it, she had an otherworld feeling. She didn't feel that she was even there. The brightness bothered her dreadfully. And she tried to listen to Dr. Zia Baghdadi interpreting what Abdu'l-Baha had said. She didn't understand anything. The tablet had dropped to the floor, and she never thought of the tablet. Then, when she got up, she passed near Abdu'l-Baha, and he ran his hand down her side, not touching it, but made this motion. And Mother was seized with a very great pain, and she prayed that that pain be removed. I've always thought that spiritual healing was easy, just over like that. It was done, it was completed, without perhaps any suffering. But Mother said the pain in her was excruciating. But as she passed on out of that room, she never saw that tumor again. One thing we haven't mentioned tonight, and I was so happy when I heard all of you laughing, Abdu'l-Baha said constantly, "You must be happy. Be happy. Please be happy."
It was a great privilege, and I do think that I had the privilege of seeing him in a little different environment from what you do when he was here in the United States. I saw how he lived there in the Holy Land. I saw a few of the problems that surrounded him, and how he gave his whole life to serving everybody around there. He was known by everyone in Haifa, as you probably realize. People would even come to him if they were ill, and they thought they didn't want to go to the hospital without seeing him first. I remember one day standing there, and he came out from his busy work and greeted this gentleman who was ill and told him if he would go to the hospital, it would be all right. And then the gentleman went to the hospital. And I remember that we thought that was a rather selfish thing on the part of the gentleman. But it shows us that the master, as they always called him, he was not, I'd never heard him called Abdu'l-Baha there. He was called the master. But it shows how he truly loved and truly helped bring out in each person their very best and help them to lead a better life, and how he was always ready to serve them. He was telling us that the important part of the pilgrimage was praying at the shrine of Baha'u'llah. He was telling us that in that way. He did give me a name. We saw him privately for a little while. My mother was disturbed because she felt that she had perhaps asked too much of her husband, who was not a Baha'i, to get the money so that we could take this long trip around. It was a difficult trip. It took 2 months to get there. A great many difficulties because the World War I was just over. England had just taken over the Holy Land, and things were not in a settled condition at all. It took visas to get into Palestine, as it was then called, and that took time and negotiating, and there were strikes on the boat as we went. They didn't want to load the coal on the boat, and we'd wait a few days in Italy for that to be settled, and so on. It was a rather difficult, lengthy trip, but it was worth it. And the master assured my mother that all would be well, that we would be all right, that our trip back would be safe, that we would be protected. And he gave me a name, Badieh.
In May 1912, Abdu'l-Baha was invited to speak at the Lake Mohunk Peace and Arbitration Conference by the organization's president, Albert Smiley. This was one of the primary purposes for which he had come to America. Prominent attendees at Lake Mohunk included the Scottish-American industrialist Andrew Carnegie, who had begun a correspondence with the master and was to meet him in New York later in November. His book, The Gospel of Wealth, was praised by Abdu'l-Baha, to whom he had sent a copy for his consideration. The master bestowed blessings on this man, and in a letter published in the New York Times, called him the lover of humanity and one of the founders of universal peace. Back in Lake Mohunk, which was situated some 4 hours from New York City by train, the master praised the scenic beauty and grandeur of the route through green hills and valleys, past waterfalls and natural springs. Many dignitaries and delegates from all over the world had been invited to attend this historic peace conference. The Reverend Frederick Lynch of the Federal Council of Churches best summarized Abdu'l-Baha's talk when he said, "The address of the evening was full of this one thing, the unity of mankind. We are in this world one. It was the most remarkable address I have ever listened to." The Friends arranged for a film of Abdu'l-Baha to be made at the home of Mr. and Mrs. McNutt. A multitude of Baha'is and their friends greeted the Master, as seen in this historic footage. That June, at Abdu'l-Baha's behest, a unity feast was held in the grounds of the home of Roy Wilhelm in West Englewood, New Jersey. According to the Chronicles of Mahmud, the Friends were ecstatic today since their host was the beloved of the covenant. Their meeting was an assembly of love and amity, and the surroundings were green and verdant with trees in full bloom perfuming the air. There was a pilaf, a very delicious Persian dish that had been prepared for the occasion, sherbet, a Persian drink, and many sweets. Everyone was happy at the unity of the gathering. The master said, "This meeting will be productive of great results. It will be the cause of attracting a new bounty. These meetings will be mentioned in the future, and their results will be everlasting in all the divine worlds." Indeed, a commemoration of this celebratory event has occurred annually ever since.
In September 1912, the master set off from Montreal to continue his visit of the Western States, stopping off briefly in Buffalo to see the Niagara Falls. He then made his way further west through Chicago and Kenosha, Wisconsin, before continuing on to Minneapolis and St. Paul, Minnesota, where he attended a number of venues in the Twin Cities. After that, he continued on to Lincoln and Omaha, Nebraska, where he gave a talk, one of many, on the impending war in Europe. He disembarked from the train in Lincoln specifically to see William Jennings Bryan, a progressive orator and Democratic presidential nominee who had visited him in Acre. He had been unable to see the master on a second occasion in Haifa due to the strictures imposed by the Ottoman authorities, but the master had not forgotten this man's faithfulness and stopped at his hometown on his journey west for this purpose. But unfortunately, Bryan was out campaigning at the time for Woodrow Wilson, whom he would serve as Secretary of State in the next administration. Nonetheless, Abdu'l-Baha extended his greetings to Mrs. Bryan, showering his love on the family before heading back to the station. He took the night train to Denver and Glenwood Springs, Colorado, to Salt Lake City, Utah, and finally San Francisco, California. Abdu'l-Baha made the journey to California primarily to meet the Baha'i friends there. One of them, Thornton Chase, had sadly passed away just prior to the master's arrival in October 1912. Abdu'l-Baha considered Thornton Chase as the first American Baha'i and paid special homage to the man, visiting his grave in Los Angeles, where he lovingly arranged flowers, bowed low, and kissed the gravestone. Altogether, he spent 23 days in California, most of this time spent at the home of Mrs. Helen Goodall, a devoted Baha'i. While here, the master had many opportunities to meet the friends, and in particular to enjoy the company of the children who flocked to take pictures with him. Years later, in 1916, Helen Goodall received a postcard from the master on which he had inscribed by hand the whole of the tablet of the divine plan addressed to the Western States. In his signature seen below, we see his distinctive use of a small A for his own name, followed by a capital B for Baha, symbolizing once again his servitude to his Lord. Another transformative event in the San Francisco area was when Abdu'l-Baha gave a talk at the Temple Emmanuel Synagogue. The 2,000 Jews present had filled every available seat. The place was packed as the master spoke about Jesus and Mohammed as both prophets of God. He spoke with such authority and conviction that no one contradicted him. His listeners were left greatly impressed.
At the invitation of Phoebe Hearst, Abdu'l-Baha also spent 2 days at her hacienda in Pleasanton, California, where guests from high society had been invited to meet him. He had last seen her some 13 years earlier in Acre on that historic visit when she had come on pilgrimage to visit him with 15 others. He much enjoyed his visit in Pleasanton and took the opportunity in this opulent setting and among these influential people to share his thoughts on the upcoming presidential elections, which were now less than a month away. The president must be a man that does not insistently seek the presidency, he said, He should be a person free from all thoughts of name and rank. He must be a well-wisher of all, and not a self-seeking person. Before his departure from the hacienda, Abdu'l-Baha asked for all the servants to be summoned. Robert Turner, the first African-American Baha'i, who had served Phoebe Hearst as a butler on the first historic trip to Akka, had by then passed away. But Abdu'l-Baha thanked the rest individually and gave each a generous gift.
The master had maintained a correspondence with Andrew Carnegie and visited his home, having great admiration for his philanthropic causes, including endowments for international peace. An industrialist turned philanthropist, Carnegie gave away 90% of his wealth before he died in 1919, funding some 3,000 libraries in the US alone, and scores of other charitable activities, which included the Peace Palace in The Hague, which now houses the UN International Court of Justice. The other titan of America was J. Pierpont Morgan, perhaps the wealthiest man in America and the world. The master visited his library on the 18th of November and described his visit in the following manner. The well-known Morgan, who owned a sum of 300 million and was day and night restless and agitated, did not partake of the divine bestowals, save a little broth. He invited me to visit his library and to have dinner. I went to the library in order to look at the Oriental books. In short, he eagerly desired that I should visit him, but meanwhile important financial problems arose which prevented him from being present. Now, had he not such an excessive amount of wealth, he might have been able to present himself. This wealth was for him a vicissitude, and not the cause of comfort. That said, the master wrote a loving prayer for Morgan in his visitor's book, ending with a supplication that God confirm him in the oneness of the world of humanity and submerge him in the sea of thy favours. On November the 23rd, 1912, the Day of the Covenant was celebrated with a splendid banquet at the Great Northern Hotel in New York. Indeed, the principal purpose of Abdu'l-Baha's journey to America was to officially proclaim his station as the centre of the Covenant, to rally the unity of the Baha'i community around that covenant, and to establish the strong foundation of love and integrity upon which the future of the faith of Baha'u'llah would stand and progress. With this in mind, he had designated New York to be the city of the Covenant. This magnificent banquet was attended by more than 300 Baha'is. At the head table sat the master with a few notables, and behind them was the flag of the United States and Persia. Before the food was served, Abdu'l-Baha went amongst the attendees, anointing everyone with an attar of rose, a Persian custom to honour guests. This was a most moving scene, unforgettable for all who were present. The master then gave a short talk. As the Great Northern Hotel manager had stubbornly refused to allow black guests to attend, the Friends organised a great interracial feast at the home of the Kinneys the following night. And here the white American ladies served their black Baha'i friends with their own hands, a symbolic gesture which brought immense joy to the heart of the master. When he finally departed the shores of North America, it marked the end of this spiritual privilege. He left an everlasting legacy of what it means to be a perfect human being. America would not see his like again.